has also healthcare. Junior doctors have accepted the pay deal.
They have accepted the pay deal, but it might mean more strikes still. This is a story in the Daily Mail, I believe. So junior doctors have accepted a pay hike of about 22.3% over a course of 3 years. It will take the base salary of a junior doctor, who I think are being changed to resident doctors now is the name for them, from about £32,000 to £36,000. I do think they probably do need a pay rise, but at a time where the Labour government is taking winter fuel payments away from pensioners, I think there will be some people who would argue, do they need to be increasing the wages of people that are unionised workers at the same time as they're taking money away from pensioners? I think a lot of viewers would be quite angry about.
That's ridiculous. Like, doing the train drivers versus pensioners is one thing. Still dumb, but at least like they're sort of in private industry or whatever. Doing it for doctors who are literally keeping the pensioners alive, you fucking mad. Like, you're not gonna, that's not, firstly, it's absurd and disgusting for you to try. But secondly, that's not a wedge issue that you're really going to win with.
I mean, people keep going into my comment section on a video I did about Labour getting rid of the winter fuel payment, going, oh, they managed to get a pay deal for the doctors. And I'm just like, oh, so you think that the people who cure you shouldn't get paid adequately after having 35% wage reduction in real terms since 2010? Like, they actually wanted wage restoration. It's not a pay rise. This is not even pay restoration. This is below pay restoration they're being offered here. And on the second half of this too, which is really ridiculous, is that actually, first of all, we need to make sure that we pay doctors enough so they don't leave. But in reality, this is saving money. Reaching this pay deal saves the government money. I know this sounds really counterintuitive to people, but first of all, we need to ensure that we have a working age population that are healthy and be able to work. So lack of doctors has impacted that because they're leaving to Australia because they're not getting paid enough. Having to continue to use agency workers to cover the shortfall during strike days, dealing with the economic consequences of lost NHS time because of the industrial action is costing the government money. It is cheaper. It would have been cheaper to have settled the strikes 18 months ago, both in the rail sector and in the NHS. The Conservative government wasted more money on fighting the industrial dispute than it would have cost to just settle and give the people the pay restoration that they clearly deserve as the public sector workers who keep our country running. People trying to say that, oh, well, you can't take money, give money to these people whilst taking money away from the pensioners. I'm like, no, this is completely separate. They're taking money away from pensioners because they have a hobby horse over this thing, going back to 2014. But it makes fiscal sense overall, when you look at the macroeconomic output to solve the industrial action, to save the NHS and actually make our country fit to work again. So it's just nonsense. It's economic, total nonsense to try and say that it's costing all this money that's being taken away from pensioners. That is a ridiculous line.
Exactly. The government have spent more money fighting the unions because A, they want a kind of culture war wedge issue, and secondly, it's just sort of the Tory done thing. They literally would rather spend that money, burning that money, our money, on prolonging strikes because fuck unions, than to actually get around the table and govern correctly in the interest of the people of this country.
Yeah, the Conservative war with the unions in the public sector, first of all, because they don't want to have to spend more money, even though it's made them spend more money, which means they're inevitably putting up taxes, which they hate doing. But second of all, is that having better paid people in the public sector will then also incentivise people, if industrial disputes get won in the public sector, to then want to unionise in the private sector as well, so they get similar pay deals. And of course, who funds the Conservative Party? Oh yes, it's private employers. What do private employers not want? A unionised workforce. So it's a collaboration between the private employers and the government in ensuring that the whole basis of trade unionism gets completely undermined by the state. So not just so they save money from the public purse, so that their private employers who give them donations can justify shitty wages in the private sector too.
So a 22% pay rise over 2 years and some backdated rises as well. What do you think, Zarah?
Well, the context is that junior doctors have seen their pay cut in real terms by 26%. So this isn't actually the full demand of pay restoration that the BMA were calling for. But if we want to recruit, if we want to retain doctors and other medical staff in our NHS, we need to pay them the wages that they deserve. And when we look at industrial action, doctors, nurses, teachers, no one goes on strike because it's the easy thing to do, is often when there is no other choice. And we know that our NHS is in a crisis. Everyone knows that who's tried to get a GP appointment, a dental appointment, anyone who's tried to have any kind of elective surgery. So this is what we need to do to invest in our NHS. And in terms of further action, hopefully we don't see that. The independent pay review bodies are independent. They recommend pay rises. And of course, the conversation is always between trade unions and the government.
But it's whether if you start giving away these massive wedges, you end up just getting more strikes.
Well, that's not how it works.
Is it not?
It's
Because people think, oh,
Whoa, the whole reason that we had strikes in the first place was because they hadn't been paid enough by a Conservative government. The strikes started under the Conservative government when they weren't giving these people good pay deals. That's why they went on strike as a very last resort. But all the evidence points to what you're saying here, Jeremy, as literally being the opposite of true.
Yeah,
It is the
exactly.
lack
I
of
mean-
pay that
Yeah, I mean, not only the history of these strikes, like you say, but also, do you think, Jeremy, your logic, quote unquote, here would mean that doctors would want to not go into work and be doctors? Is that actually how you think doctors operate? They'd prefer to be outside with their patients not being seen than by treating people. Do you think doctors go into medicine to not do medicine? Or maybe you're full of shit?
Like, there's a reason why that in decades, over half a century worth of the Royal College of Nursing, they'd never gone on strike ever. In their entire history, the RCN had never balloted for strike action. And then suddenly, after 14 years of wage stagnation for public sector workers and the pandemic grossly exploding the level to which that our healthcare workers were put under the cosh by government failure of investment in the healthcare sector, they finally pulled the trigger and called for industrial action in a way they'd never done before. Do you think that that is somehow connected to the government's actions? Or do you think that they were just striking for no reason and going to have loads of strikes forever just because Labour in government now? Bullshit, nonsense.
okay, the doctors have played a blinder here. I'm going to do the same.
Well, that's not how trade unions work. They look at the paying conditions of their work, of their members, and then they go into consultative ballots. They negotiate with employers. And actually, when we look across the board, when we look at what's happened under the Tories, workers in the public sector have not had pay rises. They've had real terms pay cuts. And if
That's
we
'cause
are
of
to invest in our
inflation.
public services, you know,
No, well, I mean, yes, because of inflation, but if wages were to rise with inflation, it wouldn't be a pay cut. It's because they've deliberately kept them to no increases whatsoever, or very, very small increases at times.
Below inflation, exactly.
Below inflation, which is a pay cut, Jeremy. So you can't just say, oh, it's because of inflation, because inflation never really stops.
often the conversation around inflation, it doesn't look at the corporate profits that are happening within the economy that have driven a lot of inflation. In fact, often a lot of the rhetoric is blaming workers who are struggling. We are a nation of food banks, more than anything.
Yeah, just think about that. Jeremy Vine's argument there. If you start paying people, other people will want to be paid as well. And then when does it end? We'll have to pay all people a living wage for working for a living.
Again, there is a reason why we've had wage stagnation over the past 14 years. And of course, this is not just something that's happened out of nowhere. This isn't just the way in which the market has turned out because God has willed it. No, the reason why we've had wage stagnation for this period is because of deliberate government policy of supply-side labour market reform. Not only was it slashing the welfare sector, not only was it engaging in contractionary fiscal policy, especially in terms of things that would push up workers' wages, and having a monetary policy committee that have really supported not having wage increases, especially in a post-COVID world where they were keeping interest rates too high for too long under the guise of workers' wages were going up too much. And of course, they spent the entire 14 years trying to push through extra draconian anti-union legislation. They did it in 2016, and then they did the minimum service levels bill in 2022. And this has always been the link that has broken down rising wages in this country, is the fact that we have some of the most restrictive trade union laws in the country. Maybe, Jeremy, we wouldn't have had 14 years of wage stagnation if people had actually gone on strike more often than they did, or threatened to go on strike. The fact that the threat of industrial action wasn't there in the private sector is why we haven't had those wages being rising in real terms for the period in which the Conservative Party were in government. Sorry to harp on, but it's really important for people who watch this in future to understand that how we set our wages, how our economy functions, doesn't happen in a vacuum. This is always a result of government policy. The way we set up our markets is a function of state policy. People try and treat capitalism and neoliberalism like it's just a fact of nature when it isn't. It's a statecraft. And the statecraft of the Conservatives is why this hasn't worked for working people. Regardless of where you sit on the income scale, your wages haven't been good unless you're a banker or if you're in the financial sector. For that period, it's been assets that have gained you wealth because of Conservative policy. And that's where people's wages have really not been keeping up with the cost of living during that period of time.
And the really disgusting element of that is, as you say, the bankers have been doing very, very well. And if there's one thing we found out during COVID, something that I was already suspected very strongly, is that if bankers don't go to work, the country's fine. If shelf stackers don't go to work, country comes to a grinding halt. But who gets paid like they're an essential worker and who gets shit on?
Exactly. It's really interesting how when we're discussing the pay increases for members of our healthcare sector and everyone wanting to get a fight with the unions in the Conservative Party, oh, so they're not essential workers now, are they? We were clapping our hands and banging our pots and pans during the pandemic for these people. Unfortunately, though, they can't pay their bills with claps. Hey there, if you enjoyed the video, make sure that you like and leave a comment. That helps the video out in the algorithm. If you subscribe and ring the bell, it'll let you know when I go live. I stream every day on YouTube and Twitch. You can also follow all of my socials down in the description. And if you want to support me in a more financial manner, there's a join button for membership to just 99p to be a member on YouTube, as well as a Patreon, and there's some merch there as well. And hopefully I'll catch you on the next video. Take care.